Okay, so welcome to the Introduction to Podcast Basics workshop. I will share a screen at various points in time, and we will, to a degree, have a discussion, to a degree, just have some opportunity to think through some stuff. And at the very end, I want you to know that this is the very, very basic workshop. Just literally, what is it? How does it basically function? How do I figure out where to start and where to get going? And more importantly, it's basic, but basic with the orientation towards action. So at the end, if you feel so compelled and you want to pursue something, you could record something today and have your show published and available for the world by this afternoon. If you are ambitious, you can wait a couple of days and have an actually robust show available by the end of the week if you have some time and you're willing to do some of the legwork. So I make that promise not because I'm guessing and not because I'm speculating, but because I've seen it happen. And I sat for years thinking about what to do and how to do it and maybe whatever. Then I figured out this one important thing. All you have to do is literally just record a couple of things and put it out there. And what today's workshop is designed to do is help you figure out where to start, what you need, and more importantly, how to get it to people. And then that other more important thing is how do I then take that one step further into the realm of, yeah, I can do this, and then just actually go forward. So that's what today will be about. If you have other things that you want us to talk about, other details and so on, I'm aiming for give or take an hour, but give or take as close to an hour as possible because that's what I promised. But I'm not in a hurry to go somewhere. So if you have further questions or greater detail that is a today kind of detail, definitely we can talk about that and I'll stick around. If you have further questions and bigger further questions, we can do a one-on-one or a follow-up session later on. And I'm more than happy to do that as well. But I'll promise you this, the last time I delivered this workshop was with a student. The time before that was also with a student. And out of both of those workshops together, I have counted three or four podcasts just from this alone. So it is entirely doable that you will have enough to get going today. And if you want to get higher end, then you can build from there. So if that's good, then that's where we'll get started. I'm going to share a screen, and that way, when I share a screen, you will occasionally look at other things besides me, and that will be all fine by me. Let's go with spotlight my video. No, pin. There we go. Spotlight. And I will share my screen now, and hopefully, in theory, you should be able to see it fairly soon. You should be seeing a screen that says Media Research Lab, Media Studies and Arts and Humanities. I would imagine that that's what's there. That's good. So that is an indication that the Media Research Lab is a position that I hold as the director of the Media Research Lab. It is affiliated with the Arts and Humanities, and it is adjacent to our central department. And Deborah, who happens to be a colleague of mine in the department, we teach in media studies, but media studies is a wide-ranging thing. And I will let you know as a first step, if this is I've never done this before, I'm not sure if I can do it. I have no business in the audio space. I have no business podcasting. I can tell you right now, I have difficulty hearing half the time, and I'm not exaggerating. I do. I have various intermittent hearing related things, and I can still do it too, mostly because I wanted to, and I figured it out. And it is enough to know that you can do the same, whether or not you come from a background that is completely removed from making any media related things, whether you have stuff, whether you have no stuff, you can do it too. So we'll go from there into the idea that I will be doing podcasting 101. This is the absolute basics, as we mentioned before. It's valuable for you to know that the absolute basics are the best place to start, because most people start about 10 steps in and figure out that they can't do it because they didn't figure out where you're actually supposed to begin. So today is a where do you actually begin question. And that's really key. And at the end, you might say, as a takeaway, it's probably a little bit more basic than I expected it to be. But I'll have you know that sitting on this since 2004 and thinking it through to launching my first podcast in 2020, that's the thing that I wasn't willing to accept. And it's literally, that's the place you have to start, is this absolute basic. So we'll start off with a very simple thing. I'm going to ask you to, because there's not a whole lot of people, you can spontaneously join in, you can raise your hand, you can do whatever you wish. But if you join in with your microphone, you can turn your microphone on and turn it back off as you need. But the question is quite simply this. What brings you to a podcast workshop? Or, okay, I'll give you 3 questions. Either what brings you to the workshop? Do you have a favorite podcast? Or what do you want to do with it?
I'll jump in, Ravi.
Okay.
It's Catherine from the history department. I'm here because I would like to have students do podcasting. I want to podcast myself in some of the committee work I do. And my favorite podcast right now is Stuff the British Stole.
Nice.
Hi, Ravi. Peter Skipper from the Education Department. I'm interested in this format because I enjoy listening to podcasts and never really gave it much thought about doing one myself, but I find it so useful. And I think that the visual or video medium takes you into an isolated spot, whereas if it's audio, you can be doing other things. You can multitask and yet get the same information. And I think it might be very useful for me to be able to do that in some of my classwork and perhaps in other community stuff I'm involved with as well.
Anyone else?
Sure, I'll go. I'm Chelsea, and I work in the Faculty of Education, but I'm also a PhD candidate at UVic, and I'm really keen to potentially use the podcast for my dissertation format. And I'm I'd been sitting with it for a couple of years, and then this email came out and there was a thread through the Faculty of Ed even just this week about other colleagues saying, yeah, like I'd be willing to accept this. And I was like, I'm gonna just ask my committee, and I got like a green light to at least explore it. So I'm here and really excited. For me, it's allowing to embrace like an oral culture as a style of communication, and sort of to tackle a lot of my theoretical frameworks are around deschooling and decolonization. And I just, for myself personally, with an unconventional academic path, I know that I just speak it like much more, my flow is just so much better in oral communication than it is in writing, despite getting here. And so I get so excited about the implications for opening up more access for folks to do their dissertations in this format and to capture sort of complexities and things. You know, you can bring in a lot more, you can bring things in and weave things in spoken ways that it would take so much more in written form. So I'm
That's
really
awesome.
keen to, yeah, thanks.
Any other? Sorry, Deborah, and then and Aggie, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so it's Deborah in Media Studies. Yeah, I'm on a documentary film festival that also produces a podcast festival, and it's just coming up. And even though all my research is visual, I think my alter ego would have been to do radio interviews. And so I kind of pine for that. And so I think it's just really interesting for me to move into something quite different.
Great. Aggie?
My name is Aggie and I'm with Raconteur, and we're launching a knowledge sharing sort of suite of things, so called Leisure Matters VIU. And so this is part of that puzzle of how do we get the results of the research we do, our students' work, our work, out to a broader audience that's not hidden behind a paywall.
Excellent.
Is part of what we're looking at. And my favorite podcast is called, and please excuse me, but this is exactly what it's called, Unfuck Your Brain. So, and yeah, that's why I'm here.
Aggie's not rude. Aggie's representing something we'll talk about in just a minute. She didn't swear because she wanted to swear. She swore because that's the name of the podcast in a way that is entirely not television, because that wouldn't be on the television schedule. And that's kind of an important thing to keep in the back of your mind. We don't have to hear from anybody, but if anybody else wants to jump in, you're welcome to.
I'll make up points. Ash and I work together. We're both associated with the Master's of Community Planning program. Last year, putting all my courses online was fascinating. I recorded them all. And then with the synchronous sessions, were actually hard questions and engagements. And I'm getting interviewed a lot with other people's podcasts in real estate development and city building. So it's watching this whole world kind of expand. We're talking all the time about stuff. We're thinking and researching interesting things. How do you get it out? You got a little tiny window with your class at a moment. They're overloaded. They can't absorb it all. And it seems like not only a good kind of, professional development business kind of scenario opportunity, but another one where it's another venue where we can have some interesting, difficult discussions about communities and where they're going, that key people can access. So I think just wanted to get the basics of this.
Absolutely. That's great. So we'll go forward from here by looking at all of these little dots. You have this idea that each one of you has a different motivation. Each one of you has a different output intention. Each one of you has a different input intention. But how do you circle that all together? How do you make that one thing? And more importantly, how do you make that one thing come together as a show? And that's the key, because you think about it as a show. But more importantly, what you want to do, and if you're here, you're not here singularly because you're fascinated by how other people do this. The likelihood is, from what I heard, all of you are thinking about, how do I make this my show? How do I put it all together into that circle that's mine? And that's the key to the whole enterprise. It's the what's mine part. Because most importantly, we have to remember one key thing. All art, or all things that are art-based forums, all things that are knowledge-based forums, are built on somebody else's knowledge and practice from before. So thinking about doing this to be entirely original is a waste of time, because entirely original is not possible and not necessary. But how do I make it my show? That's the key. So the key here is not just simply my show, but a show that I can do, and a show that I want to do, and a show that is not somebody else's show. So what we have to do in the beginning to deal with this is answer a few questions. And this is basically the agenda for today. We have to figure out what a podcast is, and as importantly, because I'm from a cultural studies background as much as anything else, what it is not. Through a system of difference, we have to figure out what it is by figuring out what it isn't, so that you can not worry about what it has to be and worry about what you can be. Then we're going to have to think about why it's not radio, and ultimately, can I do this, as opposed to can it be done? Can I cause somebody else to do it and I know how to pay them and ask the right questions so that they do it the way that I want? How do I do it myself? And ultimately, we have to get past that last hurdle. Who's going to listen? What's the point? Because that's ultimately the biggest challenge for when you think about a blog. I assign a blog to students all the time in several different classes, and many of them are worried to do it, and particularly to start, because they're worried about what other people will think about what they write. Then I asked them, which of the 480 million other blogs that are started on a yearly basis, you think they have to go through first to get to yours, to be worried about that? And most of them think I'm joking until they actually look up the statistics and recognize that it's a massive industry. And it is such a massive industry that it doesn't matter who's going to listen. If you're motivated just by listening, then you're motivated by money, in the same sort of way that in some cases, business will work if you're motivated by money, but it'll work better if you're motivated with a reason, and the reason that exceeds the money alone. So we'll start off with the question, what is a podcast? And thinking about what is a podcast is really, really quite fundamentally important, because it is useful for you to recognize that a podcast gives you a lot, and it also restricts you in some ways. So as we mentioned before, I think it was Mark who mentioned it, the idea of a podcast is largely an idea, and Deborah said as well, largely audio. These are things that I'll hear as opposed to things that I will see. What's interesting about that is that podcasts can be visual too. And in fact, your podcast can be entirely filmed and available visually, or your podcast can be entirely audio and nothing all else. Importantly, when you think about the idea of a podcast, you have to think about the fact that it can be any length. So it can be anything from a few seconds to a few hours, but people will listen to a certain length, and the length has to come from you. But generally speaking, the question of frequency is important, because it's rarely ever only once. You don't make an episode and call it a podcast. You make an episode and it becomes an audio documentary. And often people think about a podcast as one single thing. That's just simply an audio recording. A podcast suggests a degree of serialization. You do it more than once. But you don't have to feel pressure in the way that you implode on the urgency to post every day. This isn't Instagram, where you have to worry that if I don't meet my every 3-day schedule, that all of a sudden I'm going to lose relevance. You make it whatever you want it to be. And indeed, The podcast that I did last spring, I did with a class. I built it around a class schedule. So every week we put out a podcast, but I didn't put out the first one until I had 3 ready because we'd already finished 5 classes, because then I knew that I could put one and then I could put one the next week and I could put one the next week because I had a 12-week cycle in my mind that I wanted to meet. But I could have easily put them all out at the end all at once, and I could have let people binge listen if they wanted to. But ultimately, it's important to recognize that the frequency is not necessarily how people will listen to them. People will listen to them when they listen to them and where they listen to them, which is really quite important, because that means that necessarily, as you know, you can't predict the order in which people will drop in. They might drop in at the end, they might drop in at the beginning. So it's not necessarily listen to 1 before you listen to 2, before you listen to 3. People can come in wherever the search engine drops them, and then you have to find a way to make it stand alone, because as much as anything else, they are on demand. And on demand necessarily begets a lack of predictability. So it allows you to think through format a little bit differently, but that's a down the line question. Because right now, all you have to worry about is the fact that I can be myself, I can be with people, I can do fact, I can do fiction, I can do fancy, or I can do simple. It doesn't really matter, because a podcast is just a technological basket that allows you to capture audio, put it out there, and let people listen when they want to. And that's it. That's all it is. And it could be about anything. As Aggie already reminded us, it doesn't even have to be clean or tidy. It can be something that is perhaps on the edge or pushing forward. As Chelsea's mentioning right now, there are a number of communities. In fact, I'm working on, in the back of my mind, something that a student of mine who was who finished our program and then went into the community planning program. But several years ago in a class of mine, she and I came up with this idea that she wanted to pursue from her own particular interests, but didn't really see the formulation go forward, which was a podcast that I'm working on called Brown Folk, which is essentially capturing the dying folk stories from the dying storytellers in the Caribbean community, because those stories were largely told by people who were illiterate. So they never wrote them down. And when they were written down, they were written down for publication, and they were very different. And more importantly, my son and my daughter can't understand a Caribbean accent. And I fully understand what's going on. And they listen and they say to me, do you know what they're saying? And I found that really quite fascinating, because that was something that never occurred to me, that hearing is a different embodied experience than simply necessarily showing or making available in the general sense. You have to find different ways to make it relevant. Importantly, podcasts are not necessarily the same as radio, and frequently they are confused as being just a cheap version of second use for radio. And you can do that, but if you listen to a second use radio podcast, even the radio that records today's show and puts it out today, they recognize that the end of today's show that has today's interests expires. And if somebody comes on to today's show tomorrow or down the line or next week, and that's the only thing they have, well, if you're listening to today's traffic, it won't work. It just doesn't make any sense. So we have to think about a podcast as somewhat more timeless. But importantly, you also have to think about a podcast as featured by the positioning of being on demand, by being portable, as Peter said before, the idea that you can take it anywhere. So you can't assume where people are when they're listening. You can't assume that people are listening to the 5 o'clock show on drive time in their car. So you're going to talk to them about car things. You're going to think about the idea that Carol Stewart, who's the provost, as we all know, I asked her if she'd like to listen to my class's podcast, and she said, sure. And she did it while she was gardening. And we were talking about nerd culture while she was gardening, which didn't really coincide, but she said in my mind, it was good because it fit where I wanted to be. Ultimately, you can't control the listener, and you can't control how they're listening. You just know that the basket is portable. It can go in many, many different directions, and it's normally free, which is ultimately that money is no object, as in you're not going to make money, so don't aim for it. But at the same time, it is free in the sense that you can't charge people for it. So they come in with the expectation that it is free, and they're much more willing to be generous about their acceptance, because they very much will take the topic you give them. And if you're interesting and they can hear you clearly, they'll move forward. And that's it. If you're boring, or if your audio is miserable in the sense that they can't hear you, they might not. It's often as simple as that, because there are some terrible, terrible, terrible shows with massive, massive following because they just hit a niche and people like it and they are very rabidly attached to it. And there are some shows that are massively produced and extraordinarily professional, and they have the same following. It doesn't make sense that two people sitting in a garage can have the same following as an industrial machinery that puts out massive material, but it does. And it works that way. And importantly, you can't just use music, because music is owned by somebody, and that ownership does not necessarily transfer to your capacity to use it at will. And importantly, it's tricky to borrow almost any kind of content, even in the sense of I'm using this in a way that is, what's the word, is fair use as an academic. Because fair use as an academic is hard to broach the question of time. Forever and ever and ever, this is fair use. And it could be, but it could be possible that if you make anything from 5 cents to $5 million off of the use of something else, fair use sometimes can be a complicated issue. So often it's best to think about the idea of, let me make everything that I include. So we're going to get to the ultimate sort of where do we start in a second. So this is just the background stuff. The next sort of question becomes, what do I do with it? So as you all said, there are a variety of different things. The class that I did in the spring, I wrote up a thing, how I did it, what I did. What I figured was the same sort of thing that was described in the preamble. What I figured was there's all this Zoom recording time, and fundamentally, I'm trying to alter my delivery to deliver remotely. And the first semester was transfer the analog to a digital space and do it the same. The second semester was that didn't work for me. It worked for some people, but not for me. So I retooled all 3 of my courses. I made one into a game. I made the other one into a slightly more independent, go through it at your own pace. And this one, what I did was I said to everybody, you can come every week if you want, but only 5 of you are allowed to come every week, because you're going to be co-hosts of a show. We're going to have a show organized around the syllabus, and the whole class was a show. It wasn't that the whole class was recorded and then reproduced as a show. The whole class was recorded to be a show. And students actually engaged quite differently, because what they started to think about themselves as was somebody who was relied on as an expert, not in a sense of expertise, but in the sense of being articulate enough to work through a problem publicly. And that was the key transformation, was being public with the idea that learning was not something they owned, but a process that they were willing to share with others. So we worked the idea of a show, or a show format, into the foundational rotation of how the topics were discussed. And from week to week, the structure of the syllabus allowed me to be able to do that in a way that we had episodes. So it makes perfect sense. But if you think about it, every single one of your courses, if you have a course, or every single one of your research questions, if you have a research program, or any of your activities that you're engaged in, they're content, or they can be conceived of as content. And if you've ever worked with an academic publisher or any kind of publisher, or if you've ever worked with the idea of putting stuff out there anywhere, YouTube is a massively wealthy offshoot of Google, but only because people give content for free. Publishers are massively capable of distributing on scale because academics are paid by somebody to do stuff that becomes content that they make money off of. So along the way, all of these industries need content, and you're deeply invested in the space of what can be conceived of as content, but we often think of as something we're giving to students, or we're delivering with, or engaged in a relationship with students around. But we don't really think about it as, this is an interesting thing that people would like to know about. It's content. And we are in the content business in every possible way, if you want to think about it that way. So we always have something interesting to talk about. So now, with all of that said, where do we start? What is the first step in your podcast? What do you think the first step is for your podcast? What's going to be the first step that you're going to need to take? I know that's why you're here, but I'm going to ask you, what do you think the first step is that you're going to need to take?
Content, what should I talk about?
Okay. Picking a topic, that sounds good. Interestingly, most people think I need a microphone or I need some gear, I need some stuff. And often what you will find is that the rabbit hole that you fall into first is, how do I do this? And most people fall into the technological space, and you're exactly right, Mark, it is content. Instead of step one being gear, we'll play through that scenario. If you have gear, you don't automatically have podcast. You have the ability to make stuff, but nothing to make. So if you have a gear plus a little bit of work, it doesn't really equal a podcast. If you substitute gear for, if I have an idea, or if I have content, that's ultimately the only place that you could begin. So as rudimentary as it sounds, never start with the idea that this is a thing. Start with the idea that I'm interested in a subject, or I have something about which I want to talk. Maybe it's, I'm funny and I like to see how the world unfolds to me, and I'd like to share that with other people. I have an idea, not a format necessarily, not necessarily a disposition or a tone, but an idea. What is the thing around which I will organize my thoughts? How you organize your thoughts, whatever, that's a little bit along the way. But that sounds straightforward and too simple. But if you think about all of the different shows that are out there, I'm actually rather disappointed by the fact that one of the most successful podcasts, and I looked it up the other day because it just came across in a search for something. It's on episode 430, and well, I think 430. Those must be short episodes. They come out 2 or 3 times a week from essentially a factory of podcasts, but 2 or 3 times a week, 430 episodes at between 20 minutes and an hour each. That's a massive amount of content. And it is ironically in exactly the area that my research is in. And I research social theories of invisibility and how invisibility can be thought of as a manifest social concept. And the podcast is called 99% Invisible. And most of the time when I see the word invisible or invisibility in any kind of public context, it's used in a very different way than I use it, but they use it in a very similar way. And they have this massive sort of thing. So in that very, very, very post-digital kind of way, it's almost the equivalent of, I have this idea for a research topic or a business, and I Googled it. And then I discovered that somebody else is already doing it. So why bother? I shouldn't engage in it. And yet that's exactly the opposite of the truth, in the same sort of way of, I'm worried about somebody reading my blog, so I'm not going to blog. You have an idea, find out what makes it unique to you, figure that out, write it down in the same sort of way that you would as rough notes as you begin, and then you move forward from there. So step 2 then is, if I have an idea, I have to move away from the idea of just it being words, but also it being sounds. How do I transform the words into sounds? One of the things that you're going to do necessarily is, well, now I necessarily have to gear up. I have to add technique or technology to this in order for me to do that. So if we do that and we think in sound, and we have the whole notion of idea plus work plus the technology, then we get to the point where we're sort of ready to go forward. When we start to go forward from here, we have idea plus I know what I need to do. I need to organize it in a particular way. I have to set my space up in a way that works. I have to test out the equipment. And today what we're going to do as a sort of sample thing is you're going to test out talking to people and listening to yourself talk, because that's really the key. And we're going to think about some of the gear questions in a bit of a second. So what we're going to ask you to do for a second is, I'm going to throw you into a breakout room, and I'm going to ask you to start recording, in a sense. And you're not actually going to be recording, but you're going to be starting to think about how your microphone sounds and how your distance sounds and so on. And afterwards, after we finish in the breakout room, how many are we? We are 2, 4, 6, 8. Oh, that works out. So there are 5 breakout rooms. There'll be one-on-one. And it'll only be a couple of seconds. You just have to answer 4 little questions. I will put them up, and you'll be able to, hopefully you'll be able to see them. And it will allow you to just talk, and you can have a further conversation than that. But if you answer those 4 questions, it allows you to begin. and allows you to hear yourself. And what I'd like you to focus on when you're in the breakout room is actually hearing yourself and hearing what it sounds like and thinking about everything from how far away am I from the microphone, what other sounds are in the room, how does this all function? Okay, so let me figure out if I can get breakout rooms. Oh, here we go, breakout rooms. Breakout rooms, I will have, well, I guess we can only have 4. Let's go with 5. That's 1 to 2. No, we'll have 4. So one of your breakout rooms will have 3 people. And when I create them, I think you'll automatically just get magically moved into or invited to move someplace. And I will hopefully be able to put up a slide. Actually, let me do the slide first. This is all I want you to do. Take turns and listen closely. I want you to say your name, say where you are. So my name is Ravi. I am in Parksville in the Snana-Oz territory, and I have, I am a professor, I am a father, and I am a husband. And I wish it wasn't a prediction of 60 to 80, maybe 100-kilometer-an-hour winds tonight, because last week when there was a prediction of no wind, a 30-foot branch fell on my house. Just finish the sentence, and that's all it is. Your name, where you are, I am a, as in finish that sentence, and I wish something. And the purpose isn't really the content. The purpose is just listening. And if we do that, then we'll come back and we'll talk through some of the ideas of how you record and what kinds of gear you might need. Oh, good? Yeah. Okay, here we go. And Judith was asking a moment ago, and we'll maybe Judith, actually, can you ask that question again towards in a couple of minutes, because we'll go through that in terms of resources and spaces in just a second. So we'll debrief this first, and then I'll follow up with Judith's question about spaces that we have on campus and things that we can use internally. So if you notice, I changed the camera angle. I changed the camera angle simply so you can see that this is how I've been talking the whole time. So my microphone setup is a solid condenser microphone that's here, and it allows me to have a more robust, kind of richer sound than just a webcam mic. If you also notice that I'm sitting fairly close to the microphone, and if I sit closer, you can hear a little bit differently than if I sit further back, and so on. So what was your experience like? Did you listen to yourself? Or did you listen to the other people very, very closely? And did you notice anything about your microphones or about your ability to hear comfortably?
We weren't able to record ours, so we just had a good chat, said our things, and
Good.
I guess listen to our voices as we talk.
But you know, what's interesting about that is that it's exactly the same thing if you record as if you just speak out loud. And what tends to happen is once you press the record button and you have the technology there, just the same sort of way that everybody turns into duck face when you say Instagram, it's everybody changes when all of a sudden you think, oh, I'm being recorded. Your voice changes, you develop a degree of concern. I spent many, many years doing the same sort of thing as everybody else that we'll think about in just a second, thinking about, you know, one of those important things. It's weird to listen to myself publicly, but importantly, the things that you hear while you're going through that, did you hear any of the little crackles and sounds in the background, or any sort of tunnely kinds of things?
I can hear the scaffolding. I could hear the scaffolding going up outside my office window.
So
And
Catherine, maybe you can tell them why, what's going on in the office.
they're putting up scaffolding around the entire building and replacing all the windows.
So they
Um,
decided in the middle of the semester to rip down the outside walls and all of the windows, and they closed off 3 out of the 4 entrances to the building, and they made the signs
yes.
small enough. Yeah,
Yes.
they
And
made the
that-
signs small enough that students couldn't find their way in.
Yeah. But that's what I could hear. But also Chelsea said that she also had construction outside of her house. Or yeah. So that was just background noise. But the camera, the microphone seemed to be pretty decent.
Okay. How about the rest of you? What was your sound experience like?
Sound experience with Aggie, my partner, was great. I could hear her very clearly on whatever she was using, and the only background noise I have here is I can hear the ocean crashing on the shore nearby, but I don't know if she picked it up.
Aggie, did you hear the ocean?
I did not hear the ocean. I'm like you. I'm speaking on a like a proper microphone rather than my
Oh.
headphone microphone. I have a like a Yeti
Mhm.
microphone, but I would say that Peter's, I would say it sounded like it was either the computer mic or the webcam mic. It just seemed a little bit distant. If that makes sense. It wasn't echoey and it wasn't like tunnel, but it did feel like it was a little bit distant from him. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does absolutely make sense. And in various ways, when we think about the notion of sound, we think about the fact that I'm speaking, I can hear you. And when I say on Zoom, tell me if you are new to this whole phenomenon and you've never heard somebody say, "Can you hear me?" when you're on Zoom. Of course, you've heard somebody say, "Can you hear me?" And indeed, they can. And almost always they can hear you, but whether or not that's crisp and clear and high fidelity in a way that you'd like to record is not necessarily the case. But it doesn't mean it can't very easily be, improved a little bit by a few small things. But importantly, these are the ways that you have to think in sound when you're starting to gear up after you've got your idea and you're working through. You notice I got these big blue headphones on. I've got these headphones on. To be frank, I don't really enjoy wearing headphones. I don't enjoy wearing over-the-ear headphones on many levels because I can't hear the world around me. These are what are called closed back headphones. Closed back headphones literally close off the world, so I isolate the sound. I can have the same over-the-ear headphones that are open back headphones, and they don't physically look any different. It's just the way that the sound projection allows sound to come through, so I can hear the environment around me. But the closed back headphones are relatively inexpensive when you want to invest, but they're more expensive than these are the ones I already have, because if you don't have them, you have to pay. So that pay could be anything from 50 to literally thousands of dollars, but in the $50 to $150 range, you'll find stuff that is extremely good and extremely useful. But the key to the whole thing is that if you can't hear it, so as Peter was mentioning, the ocean is in the background. Well, that's great, but Aggie said there was no ocean, but what Aggie heard was a big hollow empty room, and you don't hear the hollow empty room unless you can hear yourself. And the only way you can hear yourself is if you take out everything else that's around you, because like I said, I have difficulty with some of my hearing layers sometimes. I have a son who is exceptionally and naturally talented in music, and I can't hear a tenth of what he can hear. And he regularly comes in and says, "Why does it sound like that?" And he's like livid about stuff that I can't even hear. It doesn't even register in my mind whatsoever. But he said, "I can't listen to that because it's just, don't you hear that hum?" And I don't hear the hum. I don't hear it at all, but that's the only thing that he can hear, completely over top of everything that I'm saying. He never hears the words. He only hears the hum. And what's fascinating about that is when you put the headphones on, you can sometimes hear the edge of the hum. You can hear those kinds of things. So as a very, very basic tool, get yourself a pair of headphones if you're going to get into this space, simply because when you are listening or when you're listening back, it's useful to actually be able to hear what your audience hears. Because ultimately, if you can't hear it, two possibilities happen. Your audience can hear it, so they can hear the little scratches and background noise. For example, if I use this microphone, or if I turn that guy off and I use this microphone, if I use this microphone and I have it here, or if I move the microphone around, your audience can hear all of that. It's called handling noise. Handling noise is not something that we think about, but when I was recording my podcast, every now and then I would drink coffee. And as I would drink coffee, I would put the cup down. And when I put the cup down, it's usually in the moment of great brilliance that somebody was saying something important, and then it gets interjected by some nonsense that I can't get rid of, because you can get rid of it later, but mostly you can't. And I think that's the key. If you're waiting to be able to get rid of it later, getting rid of it later is a lot harder than making sure that you do as best as you can to give yourself a decent environment in which you can control as much as is possible. And whatever you can't control, then you make sure you recognize that you have to be able to hear what it is so that it is livable. Because going back after the fact is very, very hard to do, but doing it in the moment is a little bit easier. So when you're thinking in sound, keep two things in mind. One is control as much as you can, but it's not weird to hear yourself. It's just uncommon. So start to learn to listen to yourself so that you start to know when you're talking. What you're saying is what other people are hearing as well. Go to the quietest space you have available, which means isolate yourself as best as possible. The student who I used to do this workshop with, what he said was, if you don't have a really simple quiet space, do what I do. Record in your car inside a garage. If you can't do that, sit in your clothes cupboard, because your clothes cupboard, your closet, is full of soft surfaces, and the soft surfaces absorb a lot of things. It might feel ridiculous, but if it feels ridiculous, that doesn't necessarily mean that it produces poor sound. It produces a better sound because that sound is not reflected off of a lot of hard surfaces. If you live in a place that has big, wide open spaces, then you hear a lot of big, wide open, empty space. And you can hear all of those things if you listen for them. And interestingly, if you're in a space that, as Peter said, I have the ocean in the background, I have a whatever, and you say to somebody, can you hear that? Sometimes when there is an intense amount of lawn work going on across the road from my house, the people on the other end of the microphone don't hear any of it, but that's the only thing that I can hear. So you have to figure out what you're hearing and what they're hearing and put yourself in the best position as possible. Soft, non-reflexive surfaces, ideal. You have to buy fancy gear? Of course not. What do you have at home? Well, you might have a heavy curtain. Chances are you have a blanket, and you might have a curtain rod that you can go into. You have a closet, any space you can that you can dampen the walls or make a space a reasonable size as opposed to a vast, open, empty space. Best way to go. And the other thing that is very, very key. So last year I made an open offer. If you want to, because I wanted to see what other people do with their recordings and with their D2L VIU Learn shells. What I said was, I'll share mine if you share yours, and we'll see. So I had a colleague who shared his, and he said, I recorded everything, over the summer, and I'm having a hard time making sense of why, this is so difficult. And I said, it's because you wiggle your chair the whole time you're sitting there. You're fidgeting, and as you're fidgeting, the only thing I can hear is your chair. You're monotone already. It's not a knock. It's just who you are. And that's entirely fine. But if it's monotone and it's interrupted and you're back and forth and you're spinning around in your chair, stop moving. If you stop moving, then you won't make noise. And if you don't make noise, the only thing they'll hear is you talking. And when you talk in a way that allows you to have a breath, because a comma is a breath. Every time you speak is a breath. I tend to speak quickly. I tend to speak in a particular way. I know how I speak, but I also know that I don't listen to myself very often, and it usually requires somebody else to tell me. So it's useful to record yourself a few times before you're ready to go record yourself for your show, just so you can simply hear yourself once or twice or mess around a little bit. And ironically, it'll still feel weird no matter what you do. So over the course of time, just get over the fact that it's weird to you, because it's not weird to everybody else. You probably still sound the same to them as you did when you were speaking out loud anyway. Okay, so when you're thinking in sound, keep this in mind. When you speak forward and into your microphone. If you speak above your microphone, can't hear. If you speak below, can't hear. If you speak too far away, I'm still speaking in the right angle, but I'm so far away that it changes. And if I speak too close, then it gets really different. The focal distance is the same sort of thing if you think about it this way. Like I said before earlier, I grew up in the Caribbean. I grew up in a Caribbean household. You don't look people in the eye because it's a sign of disrespect, particularly when people are older than you. But in North America, you have to look people in the eye because it's a sign of respect. If you don't look a microphone in the eye, in the sense that your voice isn't projecting into the microphone, it's the same sort of thing. By looking elsewhere, it's showing that you are not interested in capturing your voice. It's showing that your voice is going elsewhere. It travels in a different way. Very, very simple sort of techniques. But then you think to yourself, well, I don't have a fancy microphone. I'm not necessarily going to buy one. And if I do, what should I buy? Well, you have a fancy enough microphone. And in fact, all of you probably, if you have a smartphone, have a fancier microphone than you recognize. Most of the smartphones, particularly today's smartphones, have a level of quality in the microphone if it's held on a stand as opposed to in your hand, has a quality of microphone that exceeds probably the broadcast quality that you heard your entire childhood growing up. And that broadcast quality microphone, if held on a stand, like I said, without the shuffling and handling room, allows you to produce enough quality sound that you could have broadcast quality sound immediately today in your pocket with what you have. If you don't have that and you have headphones that have a mic on them and you're relying on that, use it until you can get a better mic, because those will work, but they won't necessarily provide the fidelity that you want going forward or the crispness and clearness of your voice. Some of them are quite excellent. Aggie has a Yeti, a little tiny Yeti Snowball can be $50. And if you go to the high end USB ones that plug into your computer directly, they can be a couple of $100s. The ones that I have, this particular one is attached through a device. This is not a USB. This is an XLR cable. The XLR cable needs an interface to go into a computer. And there's an advantage to doing that. There's a disadvantage to doing that. It all depends on what you want to use for your particular benefit. Now, this kind, the dynamic mic is the one you typically see on stage or at a stage for a concert or for people who are speaking. This one is half the price of these often, and you can get them from the range of about $50 to about $100. These ones start at about, if you buy a cheap one, it will sound cheap, but it's about $50 to $75 for a cheap one. On average, a decent one starts at about $100, and they can go up literally into the thousands. And you don't need a condenser mic, because quite frankly, I've been using a condenser mic for a while until I figured, well, I'm going to demonstrate what a dynamic mic sounds like, this guy, and what a condenser mic sounds like. And I quite frankly like the dynamic mic better, and it doesn't require all sorts of extra fancy things. And you can plug that straight into your computer if you buy the right kind, a USB kind, and it's plenty good enough. One of the things that I'm not going to talk about in this particular session is the idea of editing and post-production, because that's not the basics. That's the basics plus a little bit more. But honestly, you can do post-production probably with something you have. The one symbol on the side there is a voice memo from an iPhone. Voice memos from an iPhone are quite fascinating in the sense that people don't think of that as post-production. But if you record more than you need and you cut the end off and you cut the beginning off just to make it the right length, that's post-production, making it other than what it was when you recorded it. So that's, complicated cutting things, just cutting in a simple way. It's not really moving things around in a non-linear sort of way. But the other two, Audacity and GarageBand, if you're on a Mac, GarageBand is free. If you're on any platform, Audacity is free, and the university both supplies and endorses Audacity and may be able to help you troubleshoot Audacity. It's not as slick and fancy looking because it is free and open source. Well, it's not open source now. It was just bought by another company, but it is, relatively speaking, once you figure out the paradigm, or if you've ever used any kind of video editing software, the concepts are exactly the same. And if you've never used either of those, just start with cut the beginning, cut the end, and make sure that what you capture is what you want, and you can put it out right away. So we have those guys. So now we're going to think about the last important thing, which is really the third step for today, which is first you come up with an idea, then you figure out how to record, and then you've got this last real question before we get done, which is that question of distribution. Now, distribution is a key because it goes back to that notion of what a podcast is and how a podcast functions that we talked about earlier. The first idea is that when you think about podcasts, you think about the content, but then you get the content through something. All of you, if you've heard a podcast, have heard it through some sort of delivery mechanism. And what's fascinating about those delivery mechanisms is you can go to Apple Podcasts, you can go to Spotify, Google Play. You can even go to, if you're in a new space, you can go to Amazon. But there are literally dozens of podcast delivery services. And the fascinating thing about those dozens of podcast delivery services is when you read each of the names, you think to yourself, who uses this? This makes no sense to me, except each one of them has anywhere from tens of thousands to millions of people who get their podcasts from those services. Because they get them from those services, you have to remember that the fourth symbol there, that little thing that looks like a Wi-Fi symbol onto its side. That's all it's based on, because a podcast technologically is based on the idea of creating content, putting it somewhere, and telling these other services that allow users to use it where the thing is, and every time it's updated. So that symbol is the RSS feed. That's a fancy way of saying if you have resources, the resources change over time. Where are they? And when is there a new one? And so that's all it is one computer asking another computer to keep it up to date. Kind of like a calendar of sorts, but it's more like a calendar with the actual content of what the calendar is talking about. So for me, and what I would recommend you to use for yourself as a starter is a service like Anchor. So the podcast that I did in my class last spring was called Culture is Ordinary. It's called Culture is Ordinary because that is a key proponent phrase in the field of cultural studies. Raymond Williams in the 1950s started with the proposition that culture is ordinary. It's not just the extraordinary things you do in fancy places and in art galleries and so on, but culture is ordinary. And so I thought to myself, well, that's an excellent title for a podcast. It makes perfect sense and it fit with my class. So I decided, instead of focusing on all of the technological things, why don't I find the easiest possible route? So I went to Anchor FM, and anchor.fm/cardboard-boxes. That's where my podcast is found, or my class's podcast is found. But if you search in any of the major podcast platforms for the phrase culture is ordinary, you'll find the episodes. And what will likely happen is you'll find the most recent one as opposed to the earliest one. So you can search through as you wish. But how Anchor works is fairly straightforward. It calls itself the easiest way to podcast, but it's been around for quite some time. And it was a free independent company. And then eventually it was bought by Spotify. And Spotify is in the same business as everybody else. We have a platform and we need stuff. So can you make some stuff for free and provide people the opportunity to have things to listen to? So that's us. We make content and we put it out there, and Spotify is very, very happy to facilitate it. And interestingly, on Anchor FM, what they have in the downloadable app that you can use on your own phone, you can record right into the app. You can even use some sounds. They have some opening sounds and closing sounds. They have sound effects that you can use as you're going along. You can do some very, very basic editing, but it allows you to have an unlimited amount of time and an unlimited amount of episodes and even an unlimited amount of seasons. Except it's sometimes difficult to imagine the possibility that they will allow you to monetize it. The original version, they took all of your money if you made any, or if you could make money. This version is entirely commercial free. It's in the background and it's really just a proposition. You make the content, we'll give you the platform, make sure that you can continue to provide us with stuff, but they don't check in on you. They publish to Apple, they publish to Spotify, they publish to Google, they publish to everybody on my behalf. From this session, like I said before, previously, two of the podcasts that came out of it was one that was called Successful You, which was the student success coach. It was a solo podcaster, single person, who was talking about her experiences. What is a success coach? How can it be useful to you? Her podcast ranged from 5 to 20 minutes. And she went to an external provider called Podbean. Podbean is one of the dozens and dozens and dozens of providers. They have a free level. The free level is limited by time and by volume of storage. So each episode takes up a certain amount of storage and the number of people who can download your podcast. But not to fear, if you hit 10,000 people, you probably want your own private server anyway, because at 10,000 people, you can start to make money. But truthfully, most people will have between 50 and maybe at best 100, 200, 300 people listening to their podcasts, but normally much less than that. And so you don't have to worry about maxing out any kind of a service. The CIEL one, the one that's called the Share Drive, perhaps you've heard about as well, that one didn't come by them learning from me. That one came by them saying, I can do this. It's not actually, I know how to do all of that stuff. This is not that hard, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And they host it on via YouTube. So via YouTube is the place where the content plays and lives, and they have an RSS feed, that thing that we talked about before, that allows it to be downloadable by anybody anywhere. They just make it available. And it just happens to be that they're distributing it through VIU, but they could distribute it through any podcast delivery service. The Arts and Humanities Colloquium Series, for which Catherine was a key proponent for a number of years, last year they moved to additionally having a podcast called Conversations that's also hosted on Anchor. But when you look at it, you'd never know because they show it, the face of it that they create on the webpage looks like something entirely different. And the podcast itself is in the background, the technology, all of those other things. Because at the end of the day, if you think about your own experience of podcasting, you don't care about the technology. You just want to hear the stuff. And most people don't care about the technology. So if that's not your concern, don't be worried about it. Spend your time thinking through the possibility that it's quite simply an idea plus some gear plus distribution and making a podcast. And at the end, that's all you really need. Now, Judith asked the question earlier, and I think it's an important question. Is there a way for me to do this on campus? And if I do this on campus, where are the places that we can do so? Deborah mentioned in their small group that in the Media Studies department, we have a small lab, and in that small lab, we have two. One that has a 2-person station with a little bit more complicated machinery, and one that has a 4-microphone setup that has more user-friendly, but still complicated machinery that allows you to do so. And technically, the Media Studies department and the Media Research Lab are oriented primarily first in sort of an onion. The key is people who are using it in our department as students for our courses. And then outside of that is for departmental things, and then from the arts and humanities, and then it goes from there. So ultimately it is possible, but not always guaranteed that there's access to that space. In the library, there are recording booths that have 2 mic and I don't know if there's a 4-mic station, but there are stations that you can record podcasts or other sorts of audio-based things in the library as well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you don't invest a ton of money, but you use your own recordings, you can put them together, and you can put them together and distribute them fairly easily on your own without necessarily all sorts of fancy equipment. Now, that being said, and I'm 5 minutes over, but that being said, the next version of this, if you so wish, or if the more private version of it, is if you have a one-to-one kind of consideration or thought about what you want to pursue, and you really know that you want to tool it up and go forward, I'm happy to sit and have a consultation with you and help you work through the idea and see where it goes. I can't promise you access to our physical resources, but I can promise you that my orientation, which doesn't come from the let's make stuff and spend a lot of money to do so, my orientation comes from the I grew up broke and I got to make the best of what I have. So how do I use what I already have to make something more than I would necessarily have thought I'd be able to do? So learning how to use what you have already is much more sustainable than going out and needing something that is fancy. And at the same time, if you need something that's fancy because you're at that level, that's potentially something that we could work out as well if there's an arrangement that can be had.